Good morning, Mr. Pretorius. Good morning, everybody.
Morning.
Yes. Are you ready?
Yes, there'll be two witnesses today, Chair, Mr. Simons and Mr. Hlungwane, and they will be led by Ms. Wenzel.
Thank you. Ms. Wenzel?
Thank you, Chair. Chair, if I can begin by addressing the issue of the Rule 3.3 notices.
Yes.
With regard to the evidence of Mr. Simons. The Secretariat...
I don't know whether you need to bring the mic closer to you or you need to raise your voice, but one of the two, or both.
I'll try and do both.
Yes.
The Secretariat has had quite some difficulty trying to locate a number of the family members who were implicated in Mr. Simons' statement. The most glaring omission was that with regard to Mr. Mqondisi Zuma. He, unfortunately, was being traced under that name Zuma. It only later became apparent that his name on his ID document is that of Mthethwa, which is his mother's name, who was unmarried at the time of his birth, and his father is a Zuma, but he calls himself a Mr. Zuma. So once he could finally be located, which unfortunately was only last night when the investigator managed to speak to him telephonically, an unsigned copy of the statement was sent to him, and then this morning only the signed copy went from the Commission. It is regrettable that that has transpired, but unfortunately those are the facts.
Yes, what about other people? Have they been served with three notices timelessly?
The former president, Mr. Zuma, did receive a notice. He did not, however, get it 2 weeks before. There was, again, unfortunately, some confusion in our offices as to who would in fact be leading his evidence, but as soon as it became apparent that that witness would testify today and that I would be leading that evidence, I immediately prepared the Rule 3.3 notices. You will see in the statement reference is also made to a Mr. Busa Zuma. He is deceased.
Yes. So are there about, three persons on whom Rule 3.3 notices were served at different times?
Yes. In fact, Chair, if I can just count them for you. 9 Rule 3.3 notices went out.
Yes.
At various times.
And how many of those gave the implicated persons the required period of time?
Well,
or how many didn't give them?
Regrettably, none
time?
of them got the full 14 days. They didn't get that time. As far as I'm aware, besides a response from Mr. Manyi, who said he's prepared to cooperate with the Commission, there hasn't been a response from the other implicated parties. But, Chair, with your leave, perhaps a way that we could cure this defect is, should they wish to cross-examine any of these witnesses and they bring an application and you were to grant that application, that they then be afforded an opportunity to cross-examine those witnesses and to put their version and to testify before the commission.
Well,
indeed.
I'm still at the question whether there has been compliance with the requirement that implicated persons be given a certain amount of time, and if there has been compliance and they were given, that's fine, we can proceed. If they weren't given, who wasn't given adequate time, by how much time were we short, and take it from there. I just want to have clarity on that.
Well, perhaps I can tell you when the Rule 3.3 notices were served. In regard to Mr. Matwetwa, it went on the 30th of August, 2019.
What date?
The 30th of August. It must
30th?
It must be the 30th of July. They've given me the
30th of July.
Sorry. I beg your pardon. I'm just looking at the wrong column that she's giving me. I beg your pardon.
Is that not the one that you said
It's the
you got
16th.
yesterday?
Pardon?
Is that
No.
not the one? That's somebody else.
No, that's someone else. That went on the 16th of August. The one to the former president, Mr. Jacob Zuma, went on the 20th of August.
20th.
Yes.
Today is what, 26th?
No, on the 16th, also on the 16th of August. It went on the 16th of August. The one to Mr. Kulubisi Zuma went on the 20th of August. The one to Mr. Archie Zondo went on the 21st of August. The one to Mr. Manyi went on the 20th of August. The one to, this is Mkondisi Zuma or Matwetwa, only went this morning formally, the 26th of August, although he did get sight of it last night. And to Mr. James Wani, it went on the 21st of August.
Well, I think that it's not satisfactory. It may be that the witness should give evidence in regard to the Masego issue only for now. And then he can be asked maybe to come back later when everybody has had adequate notice. And his evidence, as I understand from the statement, shouldn't take long. So it's a witness that, he's a witness that can come in even at 9 o'clock and be done within an hour or so for purposes of finishing that part of the evidence. So I'm inclined to think that probably in fairness to the implicated persons, we should restrict his evidence to the Masego issue. And in regard to all other matters, he would need to come back some other time when every implicated person has had enough time after receiving notice. Do you want to say anything about that?
Mr. Chairman, I submit that is an appropriate solution. And it would be more fair. And particularly as one witness has only received the notice this morning.
Yeah, there won't be any prejudice to the commission because he can come back and be fitted in.
Yes.
Even before the witness allocated for a particular day begins at 10 o'clock, he can come in earlier. Such prejudice as there may be are to the witness in the sense that he may have to come back twice. But he might understand the situation and might have no problem. Mr. Simons, you hear what's going on. Do you have any problem if we come back some other time to deal with other matters other than the ones relating to Mr. Masego?
Absolutely no.
You have no problem?
No problem.
Okay, thank you. Okay,
Thank you.
I think let's do it that way.
Thank you. Chair, I'm told by Mr. Pretorius, apparently there is a representative here from one of the implicated parties. Perhaps he would just like to
Yes, to
place
say something.
himself on record.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you, Chairperson. My name is Yusuf Peer from the Johannesburg Bar. I have been before the Chairperson before for
Yes.
Minister Natim Tetwa.
Yes.
And I'm back here again for the Minister in respect of Mr. Simons.
Yes.
I'm instructed by my Mabuza attorneys. We did receive the 3-3 notice on the 16th of August,
Yes.
as my colleague has indicated. But
Yes.
the position the chairperson and the evidence leader has indicated, we are on the same page with the commission on that.
Yes.
So I'll say no more than that for now.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Chairperson.
Thank you. Okay. All right, then we can proceed on that basis. Is that all right?
Thank you, Chair.
Yes. And then the oath or affirmation can be administered.
Thank you.
Please state your full names for the record.
Brent Adrian Simons.
Do you have any objection to taking the prescribed oath?
No?
Do you consider the oath to be binding on your conscience?
Yes?
Do you swear that the evidence you will give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes.
If so, please raise your right hand and say, "So help me God."
So help me God.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Chair, we've taken the liberty of marking the statement of Mr. Simons, Exhibit JJ1, and with your leave, if that is suitable to you, if we could submit that into the record.
And the file containing the affidavit of Mr. Brent Adrian Simons will be marked Exhibit JJ1.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Mr. Simons, you have submitted a statement under oath to the Commission. Is that correct?
Yes. Chair.
And Exhibit JJ1 in front of you, is that the statement that you submitted?
This is the statement, Chair.
Could you please tell the Chair
One
what
second. Can everybody at the back hear? Can everybody at the back hear? Some do hear, others can't hear. Let's try and raise our voices. Okay.
Mr. Simons, could you please tell the Chair what positions you held and first let's start with how long have you worked in the public service?
Chairperson, I roughly worked in the public service for 18 years, most of that at the level of senior management, either at the level of director or chief director. And I had various positions ranging from spokesperson for former Minister Sidney Mufamadi to spokesperson for the the former late Minister Collins Chabane, both during his last few months in the presidency as well as his months before he passed on in the public service and administration. Primarily,
Okay, hang on.
Yeah.
I'm struggling to hear you myself now. Maybe it's got nothing to do with your voice or mic. Maybe it's the technicians. Maybe there is something they're supposed to do. They indicate that they don't think there's anything wrong technically.
Mr. Simons,
Maybe
if you
draw
can-
the mic a little closer to you. Yes. Okay, let's try again. Let's start with that question again.
Mr. Simons, if we have regard to paragraph 3 of your statement, you have set out a history of what positions you held and in which departments. Is that correct?
Yes, Chairperson.
So if you can just slow down
Oh.
and explain to the chair what positions you held and when.
Okay. Chairperson, I joined the public service in 2000 in the Western Cape as part of the management team of the Western Cape Government Communications and Information System. That was the national government department, not the province. Subsequent to that joining, I then joined the office of the former Minister Sidney Mufamadi as his spokesperson in his ministry, which was provincial and local government. I returned to GCIS in the Western Cape, where I then headed up the government communications unit, GCIS, in the province. I then returned to Pretoria again to head up a training and development unit, which basically was responsible for training all government communicators, whether they were at local government level or national government or provincial government. And my former late Minister, Collins Chabane, was one of the first ministers to actually undergo that training course as well. So I then worked with the minister until he passed on. So I joined him on his request at the presidency. And again, on his request, I followed him to the Department of Public Service and Administration after the election, the national election then. So I stayed with him until he passed on. And then, about a year and a half ago, I resigned from the public service and then took up a post at Parliament as the unit manager for content and information development. And I'm still there.
And
Maybe the problem is with me. There is very little improvement in terms of hearing you compared to what it was before for me. I see that some at the back say they can hear you quite clearly. Am I the only one who is struggling? It looks like I'm the only one. But of all the people, I'm the one who must hear you.
Mr. Simons, I think
The technicians are sure that there's nothing that they can do, or maybe there's something they should do on my aircon. Okay, I'm told maybe it was the aircon. Let's try again. If there's still a problem, we might have to take a break and the technicians can have a look at everything and then we can proceed. Let's try again, but you don't have to repeat what you have said because it's in here. You may continue it. Okay.
Mr. Simons, if you could try and project your voice, but also if you can try and slow down. I think you're talking very fast, and that also makes it very difficult to hear you and follow what you're saying. During the times in both the presidents...
And I'm sorry, and I think if you face me, it might help. Okay.
During the time that you worked for Minister Shabani in the Office of the Presidency, what was your function?
I was chairperson. I was asked by the minister to join his team and to particularly look at media management, media relations, speaking on behalf of the ministry. But obviously, the minister would ask for certain other tasks as well. And then some of that would include, in the absence of the chief of staff, for example, to try and act in that capacity. You also had to make sure that the minister's diary was appropriate, that the minister was meeting with the stakeholders he was supposed to meet with, and that on some occasion you actually had to make sure that there was time for the minister himself as well, which he could utilize in his personal capacity to try and get him away from the office, because being a minister in the presidency obviously is a very strenuous responsibility. So yes, it straddled. The main objective was as media. You also contributed to writing up of his speeches, and then when required to assist with administrative capabilities.
And when, after the elections in May or June 2014, you followed the minister to the Department of Public Service and Administration, what were your roles in that department?
They were very similar. Prior to the election, the minister started hinting that he might not come back as minister in the presidency. And then during the elections, I think it was just about 2 or 3 days after the election, the minister phoned and said, look, I'm not going back as minister in the presidency. I might go to some other department, but I'll keep you posted. And then he phoned again to say that it was DPSA, and he wanted me and then obviously some of the colleagues who were also in the presidency with him at that stage to accompany him to DPSA. So we had very similar tasks and responsibilities. One of the key issues was to get the minister introduced to the staff. And I'm sure that my colleague would also attest to the fact that our minister walked the entire building, didn't take the lift up in those 11 floors. He walked from floor to floor, from desk to desk, introducing himself to all his subordinates at DPSA. In some of those instances, we were asked to take notes, because you would see avocado pears, for example, on some desk, or you would see oranges on some desk. And then whenever he returned from Limpopo, he would bring all these bags of avocado pears or nachos or oranges, and we had to distribute it to the colleagues on whose desk he actually saw them. So it was media liaison, administrative, just making sure that the office was functioning properly.
And what was your relationship with Minister Shabani?
I think I developed a very good relationship with the minister. The minister would often open up and have deep discussions, not only about what was happening within the ministry or the department, but also politically within the organization, because he knew that I was an active member of the African National Congress at that stage. So we would have political discussions as well. And one of his key issues he would always ask was, what was the view of the media, and what was the view of citizens out there of the current leadership of the ANC. And sometimes he even asked me to compile some articles, especially after weekends. So I would do that for him. If he went to the political school of the ANC, for example, he would ask that I assist him. He would give a brief, and he would say, please develop a political paper on this or that topic, depending on what the topic was. So I think there was a good relationship in terms of trust and making sure that there's someone also he could talk to. And that's what we did most of the time as staff members. We actually just listened.
And you mention in your statement that on occasion he would travel in the car with you. Could you expand a bit on that?
Yes, this minister was a totally different minister to, I mean, as I say, I worked with Minister Mufamadi before. They are actually poles apart in terms of of how they function and operate. Minister Chabane was one of those ministers who would say, for example, that, look, you have a hired car, are you driving alone? And you would say yes, and you would say, okay. You would tell the security officials, the two policemen deployed, that, look, you either drive ahead or you drive behind us, but I'm going to accompany Brent, and I'm sure he did it with other colleagues as well. And that's how, for example, you would end up driving 500, 600 kilometers with the minister at some stage. And if people drive with you for 5, 6 hours for 500 kilometers, etc., you tend to, you talk, you open up, you talk about many different things. And on one of those trips, we were in the Karoo, the Beaufort West, for example, on one Sunday afternoon, and he said that, look, we're going to drive back. He was craving some fish and chips. When I told him it's Sunday, you're not going to get fish and chips in Cape Town on a Sunday. And then he asked who I was driving with, and I said, no, I'm driving alone. And then he said, nope, we'll solve that now. The two police officials still based in Cape Town, they were told to either go to their families, Minister was in good company, or they could drive behind us, which they did. And we drove straight to Key4 at the waterfront so that the minister could have fish and chips. And again, I mean, that opportunity was one where we would talk. And at that stage, we were coming from an ANC function. And he wanted an update because I was from the province, what was happening within the province and so on. And he spoke to this one and that one. So the minister was a very, very, very down-to-earth politician, even in Gauteng. He would ask you to take him from OR Tambo to somewhere in Johannesburg, or he will tell the officials to wait for him in Pretoria. He'll jump in the car with you and he'll drive with you to Pretoria. And even though we found it to be, we knew it was unusual, it became normal for us that the minister would actually do that.
Now, Mr. Simons, you're aware that the former president, Mr. Jacob Zuma, has testified at the commission and denied that he instructed Minister Shabani to remove Themba Maseku. Are you aware of that?
Yes, I am, Chairperson.
And what is your reaction to that?
My reaction was shrouded with disappointment because on one of the discussions we had with the minister, for example, he touched on the issue because he knew I came from GCIS, and he thought that GCIS was not moving in the right direction. The ANC was not moving in the right direction. He was questioning the direction the country was moving in. So yes, the minister was very clear in terms of how he would and when he would have discussions and the topics he would have. So when the president, former president, said that the minister, and I think he said it at the commission, that the minister probably was name dropping, that is totally contradictory to the character of the minister. The minister was the minister in the presidency. With that came certain, I would say, wherever you went and you said this is the minister in the presidency, people had a certain amount of respect for that office. So I just thought that the former president was not truthful when he, in front of the commission and to the people of South Africa, said that the president was probably, name dropping in terms of saying that I'm sure when he phoned or he made the phone call, he he used my name, and I thought that was incorrect. And I think that's part of the reason why some of us from the ministry are here.
Mr. Simon, if we can go back a step. You mention in your statement what happened when you were with the minister in Australia. Could you, with some detail, explain those events in your statement?
Yeah. Chairperson, it was March 2014. We were on an official visit to Australia, and I was the only official accompanying the minister at that stage. So tradition or protocol would dictate that you basically provide all services to your minister if you're on that trip and you're the only official accompanying. That means secretarial responsibilities, answering a phone, for example, making sure that if the minister wanted to get some messages somewhere, he would do that. And then I don't know how it happened, but we got word that the Nkandla report at that stage was about to be released. We had an in-depth discussion. It went on until the early hours of the morning. In fact, we even took a walk around the hotel facility just for the minister to have a smoke. He loved his smokes. And then, but also to open up and talk, get a little bit more clarity. And we then realized when the Nkandla report was released that some of the recommendations made, I think there were about 4 or 5 recommendations at that stage that was made. We discussed it in the minister's hotel room, and we agreed on how we should go about responding. Part of that response was that the president acknowledged the report, that the president acknowledged the recommendations made in those reports, and that I know in the initial draft, because I was the only one typing, I put in red, bold. One of the recommendations was that the president should pay back a certain amount. And in bold there, Minister Chabane said that I will fundraise on behalf of the president if there is a decision on how much should be paid back. That was emailed to the relevant colleagues in the presidency. I'm sure they shared it with GCIS as well. And the minister's instruction was keep the response as brief as possible. And he envisaged half a page, close to a page response, because he was saying that let's not go into the details of the issues. Let's respond to the recommendations in terms of how we see, like the one was, if I recall correctly, the reprimanding of ministers. And our response was that the president would do this and actually report back to the nation in terms of the steps that he had taken. And that was to be determined in a discussion once we had returned. The next day we saw the statement. If I recall correctly, I think the GCI statement went into a couple of pages, and the presidency had also issued a statement, and that statement had absolutely nothing of what the minister had recommended. So obviously on our side, and if I talk outside, the minister obviously was a bit disappointed because he had thought that the guidance we had given were sound communications guidance, which to some extent would have not dealt with the issue in its entirety, but would have limited some of the immediate negative responses after that.
And what happened after that when Minister Shabani heard that his advice hadn't been heeded?
Well, Ms. Wenzel, I'm not sure that the part that the witness has dealt with now is really relevant for our purposes. Maybe it is, but if you are going to want him to go further along those lines,
Yes.
I would need to know why it's relevant.
He, beyond this, and after hearing, if I understand the statement, after hearing that the former president, Mr. Zuma, had not heeded the advice that he had thought so carefully about, Mr. Shabani was very upset and then had a very important conversation concerning the removal of Mr. Maseko immediately after this. So it was in that state of mind that he confided in this witness.
Yes, but why don't we go straight to the real issue?
Yes.
we might not need details about advice that was
Yes.
given and not accepted.
Yes,
Let's go to the issue.
yes. Mr. Simons, could you please explain how it was that, as you say in your statement, Minister Shabani told you about the removal of Mr. Maseko and what he told you?
Okay. As indicated, Chairperson, the Minister obviously, he was a bit upset that we had worked and drafted some form of guidance in terms of the statement, and none of that was used. And we had a talk afterwards, and the Minister then also touched on the issue of Mr. Maseko, knowing that I came from GCIS, that I had worked closely with Mr. Maseko, etc. And what he indicated then was that the President had actually instructed him to get rid of Mr. Maseko. We had a discussion, and his views were that he at that stage thought that GCIS was functioning optimally. GCIS was performing at a high standard in terms of setting the standard or the pace within government communications, and that Mr. Maseko was giving excellent leadership at that stage. But he didn't go into the details of it, but said that he had received a telephone call, and that the President was actually saying to him very directly that Mr. Maseko needed to be replaced. And he actually mentioned the name of Mr. Manye as well. And he said he found that also a bit disturbing, because when you tell us that you don't want this DG, and automatically a secondary name was also added as to who the person must be that was following up. I was working at GCIS at that stage when Mr. Maseko was removed, and obviously we had meetings with Mr. Maseko's replacement and Mr. Manye, but that was the view of the Minister then, and that's part of the reason why I felt that even though yes, people will say your Minister had passed on, he's not here to defend himself. There are members of staff that he had spoken to. There are members of staff who were present when that telephone call came. And the Minister, from his discussion with me, was visibly, it was clear that the Minister was still upset about how that transpired. But he was telling us, or telling me at least directly, that the President had instructed him to remove Mr. Maseko, even though he was not keen on doing that.
Did you say this was during your trip in Australia in 2014?
Yes, the Minister, as I say, when we drafted the statement, we spent several hours in his room. We even took a little break just to go and walk around the streets of Sydney in the early hours of the morning. And we came back and we concluded the draft statement. It went back. The next morning we had to get up very early again because we had meetings with relevant stakeholders organized by, I think it was Brent SA at that stage. So yes, it happened during that trip where we had clearly, the Minister talked about and touched on the concerns he had regarding the removal of Mr. Maseko.
Of course, Mr. Maseko's removal or transfer from GCIS to DPSA occurred in, I think, February 2011. So he was talking to you, that is Minister Chabane, on this trip in Australia about, 3 years later?
Yes, Chairperson. We had talks about many other things, obviously, but the one that, and that's what I'm saying, I had that first-hand encounter with the Minister, and you then read in the newspapers that the Minister technically was lying, and I honestly believe that the Minister was not lying. And the same story, you obviously also heard within the rank and file of your administrative setup in the office, and I think that is why at least two of us are here to try and verify or corroborate. I don't know what my colleague is reporting on, but I am saying that that is what the Minister told me.
Okay.
And did the Minister tell you what he thought about the appointment of Mr. Manyi to the post?
Chairperson, in fact, that is how the Minister obviously opened up as well. He was not too keen, and he said it to this extent. He was not too keen on the appointment of Mr. Manyi, because when Mr. Manyi at that particular stage was also embroiled in the scandal of having tried to source funding for a private venture while there was an official discussion taking place and so on. And he thought that the one thing that the Minister would believe in, which most of us believe in as government communicators, is that you do not become the news. You speak on behalf of your Minister, you speak on behalf of your department, but you do not become the topic of discussion within the media. And the Minister was not too keen on having that appointment, but the same situation prevailed, that you are being instructed by the President who to remove and who to replace that person with.
And could you explain to the Chair what happened when Minister Manyi's 5-year term expired?
Chairperson, the Minister was not going to renew or offer Mr. Manyi a different contract. At that stage, I was also part of the management committee of GCIS, which comprises directors, chief directors. The Manco was directors. The management committee consisted of chief directors primarily, with your executive management, which is your deputy director generals and your DG. So at that stage there was no DG, and the Minister then addressed the management committee, saying that he was not going to extend or renew the contract of Mr. Manyi, and that we would allow the process to be followed in terms of an appointment. And I don't know, but shortly after that, Ms. Pumla Williams was appointed as the acting Director General within GCIS.
Do you have any knowledge of what the former President, Mr. Zuma's reaction to that was?
From the Minister's perspective, he was not too impressed with that. In terms of the discussion that happened, I know the Minister again referred to himself as being a bit upset at the chat he had with the former President, particularly regarding the non-approval or support for the extension of the contract of, or renewal of the contract of Mr. Manyi.
You also refer in your statement to a letter that you drafted to the former President shortly before the April 2014 elections on behalf of Minister Chabani, stating that he was removing Mr. Manyi from the Media Development and Diversity Agency Board as he was no longer a representative of GCIS. Could you explain that?
Can you just refer me to the page, Chairperson?
Yes, with pleasure. Paragraph 50 on page 11.
Yeah. At this stage, we were still in the presidency, and Mr. Minister Chabane was responsible for the Media Development and Diversity Agency, the MDDA. The MDDA, in fact, sent a letter to the Minister in the Presidency complaining about the position that was being occupied by Mr. Manyi on the MDDA board. That was a position that was primarily set aside for GCIS. The position was that Mr. Manyi was no longer part of GCIS, no longer representing government and therefore could not be representing government or a government department on a board which that particular seat was particularly set aside for a government department. I received it from, I think the correspondence went to the Chief of Staff. Following the correspondence with the Chief of Staff, the Minister was briefed. The Minister then gave that task to me to sort with the legal advisors in the Presidency, get that opinion in terms of what we should do in terms of the way forward. We received that opinion from the legal advisors, who then indicated that the position, in fact, should be vacated and it should be immediately handed to GCIS or returned to GCIS. I then drafted a letter on behalf of Minister Chabane, which made reference to the legal opinion, and the legal opinion, in fact, was attached to that draft letter. I don't know if the Minister, or I don't recall if the Minister signed that letter, but that letter did go to the Presidency, and if it did go to the Presidency, then I think the Minister obviously would have signed it, because at that stage, as I indicated earlier, in a ministry, you have different units doing different components, different work, and so on. So that letter was drafted, and then we never ever received any feedback as long as I was in the Presidency then. But I think April 2014 was also a period where people were campaigning. It was elections around the corner at that stage, but I don't recall any response from the Office of the President regarding the removal of Mr. Mani from the MDDA board at that stage.
Yes. Chair, in essence, that concludes his evidence that is not going further than implicated persons.
So, Mr. Simons, in 2011, February, in which department in the government were you? I'm trying to go back to your sequence.
2011, I was in GCIS. I was the early 2011. I was the director, provincial director for GCIS in the Western Cape.
Or you were not in the Presidency at the time?
No, Chairperson.
Yes. Okay. Okay. So at the time that Mr. Maseko was removed, you were in the Western Cape.
Yes, Chairperson. I was based there.
Yes. But in the Western Cape, was that a separate department or the same department, but on the provincial level, GCIS?
It was GCIS nationally, and I was
Yes.
heading up the provincial part of that department.
Okay, okay. No, thank you. You are excused. You will be asked to come back to deal with the other aspects that we talked about at a later stage. But thank you for coming forward.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Do you need me to adjourn for you to call the next witness, or are you able to call without an adjournment?
I'm able to call without an adjournment.
Yes.
I'm in your hands.
Yes, no, if you are able to call the witness without an adjournment, let's do that.
Thank you.
Okay.
Chair, the next witness is Mr. Hlungwani. He was a private secretary in the office of the Presidency to Mr. Chabane at the relevant time. Thank you.
Yes. Okay, I can administer the oath of affirmation.
Please state your full names for the record.
Abednego Hlungwani,
Do you have any objection to taking the prescribed oath?
No.
Do you consider the oath to be binding on your conscience?
Yes.
Do you swear that the evidence you will give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? If so, please raise your right hand and say, "So help me God."
So help me God.
Thank you. Yes, you may proceed, Ms. Wenzel.
Chair, with this witness, again, we've taken the liberty of naming his statement Exhibit JJ2, which we would like to submit into evidence.
The file containing this affidavit of Mr. Abednego Shungwani will be marked Exhibit JJ2.
Mr. Rungwani, the Exhibit JJ2 in front of you, is that a statement deposed to under oath by you, submitted to the Commission?
Yes, it is.
Could you please give the Chair details of your employment with government?
Thank you, Chair. But on the statement, I would want to just make one correction if the Chair allows.
Yes,
Just on the first page, my name reads Abednego.
yes.
So ABE, that G should be D.
Oh, yes,
Other than that, the statement is correct.
yes.
Thank you, Chair.
Will you, Ms. Wenzel, just arrange for a fresh page 1 to be done?
Yes, I will make sure that
Okay.
that is amended, and I apologize to you.
Okay.
Thank you.
I regret that, sorry. If you could then have a look at paragraph 3 of your statement and just explain to the Chair what positions you've held in government.
Thank you, Chair. My employment in the public service spans over 22 years, but mainly started in Limpopo provincial government, and mainly from July 1997 to almost 2010. I served in various government positions in the departments of Finance and Economic Development, Environment and Tourism, as well as Public Works. And it was until then, 2010, 15 March, that I assumed the responsibilities of private secretary to the late Minister Chabane. It was exactly 5 years with him, because I started on the 15th of March, 2010, and sadly passed on the 15th of March, 2015. I spent almost 5 years with him. But what had happened is that for the period 2010 to almost 2013, thereabout, maybe May, I was a private secretary to Minister Chabane. When the former chief of staff, when the presidency left, I was appointed to act as the chief of staff in the office of late Minister Chabane, and got to be appointed fully to the position in February 2014, just almost 3 months before the elections. After the elections, Minister Chabane, almost in the night when ministers were appointed by the president, did text me in the early hours of the morning. I think it would have been the 25th or 26th of May, after the elections in 2014, that he would like me to proceed with him to the Department of, or should I say Ministry of, because that's how we would normally call it, Public Service and Administration, to which I served as Chief of Staff until the date he passed on. And of course, I can also indicate that at that demise, former President Zuma appointed Minister Mtetwa to be acting minister between the time when Minister Chaban passed on to the time Minister Ramatlodi was appointed Minister of Public Service and Administration It would have been around September 2015. So Minister Mtoto acted for almost 6 months, and Minister Ramatlori came through in September. And late December of the same year, I had already asked or expressed my wish to get out of the political office. Of course, not in a bad way. At that point, I felt I had done enough in the ministry and wanted to do something else, even if it meant in the departments. And that is why today, Chair, I'm the Chief Director in the Office of the Director General, Department of Mineral Resources and Energy.
Thank you. You have detailed in your affidavit what your duties were as the Chief of Staff in paragraph 4 on page 2 of your affidavit. But for purposes of your evidence today, the relevant position was your position as the private secretary to Minister Shabani.
Correct.
Could you please tell the Chair what were your duties as private secretary?
So the private secretary or the chairperson, the work that I entailed or that I did in detail was coordination in the main of the minister's programs, but in particular issues relating to the diary. I say this because as a minister, firstly, you are a member of parliament, so there will be a parliamentary program. And next, you are a minister, you have executive authority duties. But at the time, Minister Shabani was both a member of the National Executive Committee of the African National Congress and also served in the National Working Committee of the ruling party at the time. And as such, he had a huge program, and my responsibility was to coordinate that program. But also, generally in the office, you will be responsible for his logistical duties, which would involve travel, coordination of all matters that relates to his office in terms of the support staff, support service that you give. And that will also include secretarial services or any other assignment that the minister would assign to me at a given point within the ambit of the law. Of course, in terms of the instructions that he will give me, I would need to carry those in support to his executive duties.
Thank you. Mr. Hlungwane, you have heard, I believe, that the former president has testified that he did not call Minister Shabani regarding the removal of Mr. Themba Maseko in late January, February 2011. Would you like to comment on that?
Yes, Chair, I've had that testimony. I think it was on the, my recollection serves me well. Former President would have started here on the 15th of July this year to testify, but that aspect came on the 16th. Yes, I had it, Chairperson.
And would you like to comment on that?
Chair, I could only talk about what I say so in the statement in terms of an incident that had happened within a particular period. And let me state so, Chair, that well, when I had that, maybe let me take it a little bit backward.
Yeah.
Firstly, it was Mr. Maseko himself who testified before you and said what he said. The record will speak for itself. I then had the testimony of former President Zuma at the time. On both occasions, I had taken a resolve not to come here for various reasons. One, I have great respect for former President Zuma. Secondly, the incident that I would speak about, it was an incident between what we might call, for lack of a better word, an employer and employee. And because now the employee is normal, I found it difficult, and I felt it would be very odd of me to come and talk about that incident. But because of a particular indication from the Commission through you, Chair, at your invitation, because of what may have happened between a particular period of time, I've acceded when your investigators requested that I come through. And that's why I wanted to take it back to say I do wish not to be here. And through your invite, I obliged. Thank you, Chair.
Yes, let me just say that because there are two different versions about how Mr. Masego got to be transferred from GCIS to DPSA, it's quite important for the Commission to establish what the truth is. And to that extent, it needs to hear from people who might have information, whether that information supports the version put up by former President Zuma or it supports Mr. Masego's version or doesn't support either of them. But it's important that the Commission gets to know exactly what happened. So that's the context in which the Commission is trying to look at people who might have information as to what happened. So that's how people like you come in. That's how people like Mr. Simons come in. Yes.
Thank you, Chair. I respect that. Thank you.
Mr. Hlongwane, if you have regard to paragraph 5 of your statement onwards on page 2, you refer to a telephone call that you received from one of the former President, Mr. Zuma's private secretaries. Could you just explain what transpired to the Chair?
Let me state, Chairperson, on the outset that Minister Chabane served President Zuma, or under President Zuma's administration. And the two offices, what we would call the private offices, the private office of the President and the private office of the Minister, the two offices will often talk.
Now, only talk
in terms of the officials from both offices, if anything needs to be done.
Would be in conversation.
Correct.
Yes, okay, all right.
So on this occasion, I think it would have been January 2011, I think. I received a call from one of the private secretaries of the President, and I think she indicated that they were abroad at the time.
They were abroad.
Yeah. At the time. And wanted to check if I was, or if Minister was close to me or was in the office at the time, because former President would like to talk to him. And I think we're in the Union buildings on the day, because of the Presidency has got two offices, one in the Union buildings and another in Danehays. But on that occasion, I think we're in Union buildings. I did respond to say, yes, he is in the office. And as the private secretary at that point indicated that they'll call back, I must inform the Minister to expect a call from the President. Moments later, a call came through, same private secretary, on my cell phone number. As I received, because maybe I should indicate that in between when she indicated that I must inform the Minister to expect a call from the President, I stood up from my desk and went to Minister's office and relayed the message which I had just received. And moments later, when the call came through, I then responded to walking towards the office and indicated to the Minister that here's the call that I informed you about. I handed over the phone to him, and I must point out at the point it was still the private secretary on the line. It was not the former President. It was still the private secretary on the line. And then I handed over the phone to him. After which I walked back to my desk. As you would imagine, Chair, Minister will be in one of those bigger offices, and I'll be just adjacent to his door. And I walked back and closed off the door behind me. After a few minutes, Minister came through, probably 2 minutes or 3 minutes later, came through from his office and handed back the phone to me. And the day continued.
And at that stage, did the minister say anything to you about the call?
Chairperson, no, he didn't say anything. He walked back to his office after handing over the phone to me.
So you mentioned that when you handed over the phone to the minister, at that stage, the person on the line was the private secretary for the president and not the president himself.
No, it was not.
Yes.
Even in the initial call, it was to check whether minister is close by or is in the
Yes.
office.
Yes.
To which I responded in the affirmative to say, yes, he is around.
Yes.
And that I must inform him he will expect a call.
Yes.
It didn't last for 10 minutes. All between the first call to the second call to minister taking the phone and speaking and returning the call, it could have lasted less than 10 minutes.
Yes. Okay.
Yes. And yes, it was not the former president on the line. It was still my colleague who called me.
Yes. Okay.
Thank you.
You indicate in paragraph 12 on page 3 of your statement,
Yes.
you say what you've said here, you were not privy to the conversation between Mr. Zuma and Minister Shabani. But you say, however, after speaking to Mr. Zuma, Minister Shabani...
Hang on. Don't lead him on that. It's an
Yes.
important part.
Yes. And
So let him say it if he wants to, if that's his evidence, without leading him.
yes,
You will find a way of asking without leading him.
yes. What occurred after Minister Shabani handed your cellular phone back to you?
Chair, like I indicated just a moment ago, he went back to his desk. And I think we continued with our day in the office. But at the point when he left the office on the day, he did indicate to me that he would like to talk to Temba. That's how he put it.
Who was Temba?
Mr. Maseko.
Mr. Maseko.
Yes. After which I think I did mention I might have called the head of Mr. Maseko's office at the time to indicate that the minister would like to talk to Mr. Maseko.
Who did you make the call to, Mr. Maseko,
No,
or to
no,
somebody else?
No, Chairperson, the head of Mr. Maseko's office, it would have been a director at the time.
Yes.
My recollection, it would have been, I'm not sure this is appropriate, because in the earlier evidence, you indicated
It would be one of the directors in his office.
Yes, I think his office was headed by a director at the time.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
It was a lady.
Yes.
After that, did you and Minister Chabani have cause to discuss anything further about Minister Maseko?
Not really, and that's why the distinction I make, Chairperson, of my roles during the time when I serviced Minister Chabani, is that there was a period I was a private secretary, and there was a period I was a chief of staff. The private secretary position, in the main, it's secretarial or personal assistant support to the minister.
Yes.
While chief of staff, you can argue that you are more of an administrator-in-chief in the office of the minister, or if in the president's office, the head of the president, private office of the president, deputy president, and so on.
As a
And
kind
those
of
are strategic.
managerial.
Yeah, it's a strategic position. So there could be areas where you sit in management meetings with the minister, where you sit with the minister in key meetings in which decisions are taken. So I didn't discuss in detail, except on one occasion, of course, when he was leaving office. It would not have been on that day, and I think like Brent testified that he was quite an open person. And times when he walks out of the office chair, you would walk through with him with security to the car And he would just say something. And on one occasion, he did say that we would have to move timber. That's all he said. I didn't ask why. I just said, oh, okay.
And repeat what he said.
We would have to move timber.
He said we would have to move timber.
Yes, and timber, chairperson, and my apologies, I keep on saying timber because that's how he put it, but we're referring to Mr. Maseko.
Mr. Maseko.
Correct.
And how, do you remember how long after that call it was when it would have been when he said that a day, 2 days, a week, or much more than that?
It wouldn't have been more than a week.
It wouldn't have been more than?
It would not have been more than a week.
Okay, so it would be a few days.
Yeah, a few days after that.
Okay.
Except that on the day of the specific call, and I must emphasize, Chairperson, that as I said before, it was not unusual to speak between the private officers.
Yes.
On that particular day, he only said to me he would like to talk to Temba.
Okay.
Are you aware if Mr. Maseko was subsequently removed, and if so, how did you become aware?
Yes, I think it's a non-fact. Mr. Maseko was moved on the 2nd of February that year, which
2011.
Yes, it would have been a week after this incident that I'm referring to, Chairperson. It would have been a week after this incident that I'm
after
referring
the phone call.
Yes.
Okay.
I think it was on the 2nd of February. There was from my records, is that on the minister's diary he was in cabinet. He was in cabinet,
yeah.
Yes, he was in cabinet on that day, and cabinet was in the union buildings, if I recollect well. And what then happened was that there was news feed that was going through. I think in the main it was ENCA. I don't know whether it was still ENCA at the time or it was ETV or something, E-News channel, something like that, to the effect that Mr. Maseko has been removed or moved from the GCIS as CEO and will be replaced by Mr. Manyi. I think that's what the caption of the news was. But minister was in cabinet at the time. And maybe let me mention this. The lady that I'm talking about in the office of Mr. Maseko's office,
yeah.
On the day of cabinet, and maybe let me place this within context, Chairperson, so that it's clear. On the day of cabinet, Mr. Maseko was the chief executive officer of GCIS, but his mostly called title was government spokesperson.
Yes.
So he sat in cabinet. And my understanding is primarily it is to understand what would be the decisions that cabinet would like to be communicated a day after, because after each cabinet meeting, and it's known, journalists would know this, that GCIS would call a post-cabinet media briefing.
Conference.
Yeah, in this case, I think it's Minister Mtembu is the one who does that. So he did that as Chief Executive Officer of the GCIS. So the director in his office would be either in Cape Town or Union Buildings, will be in Tennis or Union Buildings on the day of cabinet to support Mr. Maseko, but she doesn't sit in cabinet. She would be normally within the building, or what you would call a cabinet lounge. So there's a place where as everyone arrives and they should be there, or she would be right where I was sitting. There was a couch next to my office, so she would come and sit there and work because there was also a space that she could sit. And I think she did alert me to the fact that I think she put it in a form of a question, is Mr. Maseko being removed, something to that effect. And so we became aware of that which was going through in the media. And while minister was down in cabinet. And I think that's how we became to know about it. And like I indicated, Chair, Minister Chabane had not said anything to me
Yes.
about removal.
Yes,
except that I could only pick up on the day that is being removed.
yes,
So the removal part, in terms of what he said, he only said we would have to move him. But whether that decision had been finalized and when will Mr. Maseko leave, I didn't know,
okay,
except when the news started filtering on the day.
okay.
Could you please have a look at a document? It's Annexure AH 13, it's Annexure 1, it's page 13, Annexure 2.
Maybe let's take the tier
Yes, I beg your
adjournment.
pardon.
Yes, let's take the tier adjournment. It's 21 minutes past 11. We will resume at 25 to 12. We adjourn.
All rise.
Gavin Watson died in a car crash. Watson. But I'm going to talk to you about it
it because my timing was meant to be midday.
Okay, no,
If
that's fine.
the chair could allow me to.
Okay,
Thank you
that's
very
fine.
much.
Thank you.
Like I indicated earlier on, the news started filtering through on the 2nd, on the cabinet day. But on the time when he said to me, we would have to move Temba, I said, oh, okay. And so who would replace him? I did ask that question. But look, it was a casual talk as we were walking to his vehicle. He did mention that it would be Jimmy Manyu, and I didn't ask why. At the time, I knew that Mr. Manyu was DG at Labour, but could have been on suspension at that period. But I didn't ask. I didn't see
Yes.
that to be a problem because it is possible to move one DG to another department.
Yes.
Yes.
Then, if you would have regard to Annexure AH2, it's page 13 of the statement. Could you explain to the Chair what this is?
Thank you, Chair. And with the benefit of having moved to DPSA, it's that department that is responsible for preparing documentation that gives effect to either appointment of a DG by cabinet or prepare that which you have before you. I see this is and I must indicate that this is what the commission places before me. It's not my document. I see it as a president's minute. It is an instrument that is used to give effect to a decision that is taken, no matter at what level. So what happens is that, maybe if I could illustrate this point, is that if the position of a DG is vacant and it's to be filled, it will go through the normal process of advertisement, and once that process of interview is done, the appointing minister, or where the DG will go to, will write to the Minister of Public Service and Administration and say, I would want to fill this position. This is how I've satisfied myself with all the relevant prescripts for appointment. It is the Minister of Public Service and Administration that takes that cabinet memorandum to cabinet to decide on the appointment. However, if it is a transfer, and I think the relevant section of the Public Service Act will attest to this, there will be, say, DGA needs to be moved to a particular department from where, and it can even start by a minister saying, no, I would want to transfer or request the transfer of a DG from a particular department. But firstly, what the Act says is that that minister who wants that DG transferred there would need to request for what is called a concurrence from the minister where that DG is situated or is employed. Once that concurrence is received, I think the Act also goes on to say even the incumbent would need to give concurrence, either he agrees or not to the transfer. But I think it says concurrence, or if it is in the public interest or in the interest of the public service. I think that's what the Act says. So the two ministers where one DG moves from, and the one, so I can call them receiving and releasing ministers, will both have to concur. And once that process has been fulfilled and the incumbent DG has concurred, those three concurrences will then go to the Minister of Public Service and Administration to prepare this instrument that the Advocate Wenzel is leading me to, which is called the President's Minute. And I take it, this is what the Minister of Public Service and Administration would have prepared at the time. Thank you, Chair.
Do you recognize the signature of the Minister of the Cabinet?
I stand corrected, but I think this is Minister Baloyi. Minister Baloyi. I think his first name is Richard Baloyi. He was the Minister of Public Service and Administration at the time.
Yes.
Yes, this is Minister Baloyi's signature. I say so, Chair, with confidence,
Yes.
because Minister Chabani, Minister Baloyi worked a lot closely, because Minister Chabani was responsible for the performance monitoring and evaluation unit. And public service in general, you'll be having a lot of interactions on public service matters, and there will be a lot of interaction between Minister Chabane and Minister Baloyi.
Yes.
But they served in many fora.
Yes.
Ministers' committee on
Yes.
budget, because
Yes.
whatever is decided at finance has an implication on what the public service will look like.
Yes.
So I can recognize this.
So this is his signature.
Yes, Chairperson, but I think records from the DPSA, where you probably have received this minute,
Yes.
can show,
Yes. Okay.
or handwriting
I
express
just
can
wanted
verify
to.
this.
I just wanted to understand your level of confidence in
Now,
saying this is his.
This is signature.
It is his signature.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
You can see from the minute that it's signed on the 3rd of February 2011. That's the day after the cabinet meeting.
Yes, Chairperson, I can see.
In your experience, how long would it usually take to get to the stage where such a minute was signed after a decision had been taken in cabinet?
Well, Chair, I never dealt with matters of this nature then. But this is a legal instrument, which is called the President's Minute, which the President is the final signatory to it. So there will be a number of people. Director Legal will need to be involved in the preparation of a document like this. And from my experience when I was at DPSA, maybe let me use the issue of a cabinet memorandum. There would have been a person who drafts the memorandum internally. The Chief Director Governance would sign that memorandum. The DDG, Deputy Director General Governance, will sign that memorandum. And then finally, the DG will sign that memorandum before the minister, where it says Minister of Cabinet, signs it. So if you work backward, it would mean by the time the former president, from what I see, being his signature here, when it's dated the 3rd, so it means work would have begun some days before. I can't say how long it will take. Look, departments differ. Others are faster, others are slower, and it depends on the processes that people put in a different department. I know that for cabinet memorandum, at the time when Minister was Minister of Public Service and Administration, we always advised if departments could give us memorandum in time. But what is key is this, that cabinet sits every second week. So the week prior cabinet meeting, it will be what is called cabinet committees. It's not full cabinet. And in those cabinet committees is where you have, if I'm not mistaken, president and deputy president chairs, but deputy minister sits there. But because deputy ministers are not members of cabinet, they don't sit in full cabinet. It only sits in every second week. So I would assume, process-wise, this would have been processed before.
Thank you. You testified that at the end of January 2011, one of former President Mr. Zuma's secretaries called you and said that they were overseas. Do you know who called you?
Chairperson, I can't recall exactly who called, but I can, like I say in one of the paragraphs in my statement to say it was not unusual. And I can use a typical example. On the day former President Dr. Mandela passed on, we were the ones who were abroad at the time. And a message came through to say, are you guys still in abroad? And said, yes. It came through to me as an SMS. And I said, yes, but we'll be boarding early hours of the morning from Dubai back home. And they said, please advise the minister that President will be addressing the nation in the next 30 minutes just to announce the passing away of former President Mandela. To which I was actually finalizing the packing in my room where we were, because we were to depart for the airport at the time. So I quickly finished, and then I called him on his landline in the hotel room. I said, hey, Minister, we need to talk urgently. Then I walked to his room and then I informed him that Bari Utata has passed on. And then we quickly left for the airport. So I'm saying it was not unusual. Every now and then it would happen, yes. If and there's a message to be relayed to the minister, often the two private officers would communicate through the officials. Yeah. So I can't recall exactly, but I do know the colleagues whom we worked with during that period.
And could you tell the chair how many private secretaries the former president had at the time?
I think he had 3, but let me qualify it to say there is a private secretary appointed, I think it is at the level of a director, and other 2 assistant, what is called assistant private secretary. And I say this, Chair, because this is how the ministerial handbook, I think this is how it defines it, if I'm not mistaken. So yes, there were 3 at the time. Yeah, that period there were 3. I joined 2010, and I think almost all of them were there at the time when I arrived here.
And do you know their names?
Yes, I think the private secretary to the president was, I think it was Mr. Elsis Tolle at the time,
Yes, you can tell the names.
assisted by Ms. Nonhlanhla Majek or Majake. I can't spell that, I can't remember, it's Majek or Majake. And the other PA was Milka.
The third one was?
Miss Milka Busuha.
Okay.
Yes, it was those 3 private secretaries to the president, former president at the time.
And are there any of those 3 who you could discount or you think it would be unlikely was the person who called you?
I wouldn't, anyone would call. Okay, maybe let me put it this way, Chair. The reason why we say 3 private secretaries, we don't mean that at any given time the 3 are with him. They were sharing responsibilities.
Yes.
Yes. So I do recall on the very first day I started working on the 15th of March, when I walked into the office there, I was told I need to go to a diary meeting. So what was happening was the private office of the president, the deputy president, minister in the presidency for performance monitoring, which is us, and minister in the presidency for National Planning Commission, which was Minister Manuel at the time, would meet and discuss and share diaries, because that was key for planning, that was also key for purposes of protocol and logistics and all of that. So once it's agreed to, we will all disperse to our respective private offices and share responsibilities. And in the case of a private office of the president, I think they were sharing responsibilities. So one would take, I don't know how it was allocated, probably 3 days, another one 3 days. So at any given time, and you also recall that when former president was here, he did mention, I think when he was referring to the threats that would have gone to his PA from the ANC side. So yes, but in the office there were 3 and share responsibilities. Anyone would call at any given time if there is a message to be relayed to the former minister. Just like in the office, I was a private secretary, but I had an assistant private secretary.
Yes. If we could move to a final aspect, could you please tell the chair what occurred on the 16th of July 2019, which the record will show is the day that the former president, Mr. Jacob Zuma, was testifying with regard to the removal of Mr. Maseko?
Well, Chair, and maybe let me also say this is one of the reasons why I said earlier on that I would have preferred not to be here.
Yes.
Because it turns out to me that on that day, there was a lot of social media back and forth.
Yes.
And the media reports do show that there were reports where the media was reporting about that testimony. So I did get one call, and it said something like, you dare say something about what you know about the removal of Mr. Maseko. But I didn't take it serious, Chair, because I'm not on social media, so I didn't see what had happened. Only when Mr. Brent Simons, who testified before me, informed me that he had tweeted, and there was a back and forth and what goes. So I thought maybe that was because of that. I had not raised this with anyone except close family, my younger brother and my cousin. Only when the commission's investigators approached me, I then opened up. Yes. But I can assure the chair that it was on that day, and I didn't take it serious. I must be honest. I mean, even the colleagues that I mentioned as being former private secretaries of the president, they are very good colleagues of mine. The other time we were flying to
Yes.
Cape Town, I was with Milka in the plane,
Yes.
and we greeted. And so I never
Yes.
took anything.
Yes.
Like, I didn't take it serious. I must be honest. Only then that I started. When I had what had been happening in the social media, which even today, I've decided not to check what it was.
Yes. But you say somebody called or
Yes.
sent a text message. Was it
It
calling?
was first a call
Somebody
from a
called.
private. Yes, I've given the details to the investigators.
Yes.
A private call, and then a text, which is reflected, I think, on page
Yes, I think
6.
I saw
Yeah,
it.
which I can't say on
Yes.
national television if this is on television.
Yeah. But which, would it be correct to say the message sought to say the least, discourage you from saying anything about the removal of Mr. Masego? Would that be correct?
Yes,
To say,
exactly. It was
to
about
say
that,
the least,
yes.
that's what it was.
Correct. The private call, the voice call.
Yes.
That's exactly what it said.
That's what it
Yeah.
said, yeah. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That concludes the evidence from my side, from the Commissioner's side.
So, as I understand your evidence, and you must just tell me if my understanding is correct, you remember these particular 2 calls in 2011, about a week or so before the 2nd of April 2011, which came from one of the private secretaries of the former president.
Yes.
The first one said, are you close to or near the Minister Chabane?
Correct.
And you said yes, and then the caller asked you to inform Minister Chabane to inform him to expect a call from the former president.
Correct,
Is that correct?
Chair.
Yes. And within 10 minutes or so, the second call came
Yes, Chair.
from the same private secretary,
Yes, Chair.
and it came through your cell phone.
Yes, Chair.
And in the meantime, you had informed Mr. Chabane
Yes.
to expect a call from the former president.
Yes, Chair.
And when you got the second call, you walked to Mr. Chabane's office and handed him the phone.
Yes, Chair.
And basically said, here is the call I told you about earlier.
Yes, Chair.
That's right. And then you left the office.
Yes, I walked back to my desk.
Yes. So the one thing that you are saying is you don't know for sure whether the person that Minister Chabane spoke to on the phone
Yes.
was the former president.
Yes.
All you know is that you were told that he
He wants to
he
speak.
wanted
Yes.
to speak to
Yes.
to Minister Chabane,
That's correct, Chairperson.
and you were not privy to the conversation.
No, and I say so in my statement.
Yes, yes. But you do say later in the day, is that correct?
Yes. Could have been less than an hour after he walked out of the office.
Oh,
Left, yes.
okay,
Yeah.
okay. Probably within an hour or so, when he was leaving office, or at least he was walking out of the office, he mentioned to you that he would like to speak to Mr. Maseko.
Yes, correct.
Yes. And did he indicate when he would like to speak to him?
No, he didn't.
He just made that
He
statement.
just made a statement. What I did was to inform the director in his office, Mr. Maseko's office, that minister would want to speak to Mr. Maseko.
Yes.
Sorry, Minister Chabane would like to speak to Mr. Maseko
Yes,
given time.
but you don't know if and when they spoke
No.
pursuant to that.
No, I don't know. With hindsight, I can only recall what Mr. Maseko said.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. And then you say that the next thing that happened was on the 2nd of Feb, is that right?
2nd of February, it was the day of the
2011.
cabinet.
Yes. What is it that makes you remember those two calls so well?
No, the one on the one that was,
The one that came from the private secretaries asking you whether you were near or with Minister Chabane, and the one that came after that to say the former president wanted to speak to Minister Chabane. What makes you remember those calls so well after so many years?
Chairperson, like I said, it was not unusual for communication between the private offices of the minister. And as I do say, there will be calls now and then that happen between the offices of the office of the minister and the private office of the president. And I do recall that, to the best of my recollection, it was around that period. And I also, like I do mention, Chairperson, that at any given time when something was required, maybe let me use the specific example where week of the State of the Nation, for example, we in Cape Town, and calls will come and say, where's minister would want him to look at the statement before, or maybe to make an input to the statement. So I'm saying, and I think like Brent was indicating that he was told this is how it happened. But I do recall, Chair, to say around that period, this is the call that came through. All I don't know is what the discussion was on the phone.
You see, the fact that you say it was not unusual for you to get calls from the former president's private secretaries, that should make it difficult for you to remember a particular call. If it was unusual for the private secretaries to call you, then I would understand that you can't forget that call because it was unusual. But if you say it was usual for them to be in touch with you, to call you, that seems to suggest to me that that's a reason that should suggest that you shouldn't easily remember any particular call from them. What do you say to that?
I take the point, Chairperson, but perhaps the events that followed thereafter. And
yes, well, that's
yeah.
Basically, I want to understand that how you, out of all the calls that you may have received from either that particular private secretary of the former president during a certain period of time, over maybe some years, or from the private secretaries of the former president, why would you remember this particular one? So that's what I want to try and understand, or these particular two.
No, I understand, Chairperson, but as I say, on that, the events that followed thereafter just gave me this particular impression that probably...
Tell me about that impression.
The impression that I got was that why would, on this particular 7 days, if I were to put it this way, three things happen. The call, we would have to move Temba, in his words. I would need to speak to Temba, although, of course, to speak to Temba as well would be something that he would do every now and then.
Would be usual.
Yes, that would be usual. Now, and then comes the news that happens on that particular day, And then
That's
as-
now on the 2nd.
On the
of
2nd.
February. Yeah.
Yes, and immediately that happens, and I think the news was to the effect that he's being replaced. In other words, he has already been replaced, and he was still in cabinet, by the way, which means if he was replaced, he wouldn't have been in cabinet on that particular day because he had already been. So it created that impression that probably there's a link between the call and the subsequent events that happened. The difficulty, Chair, that, and I can understand what Chair is asking, is that I can't stand here and say I had President Zuma say, remove Themba Maseko. I
Yes,
can't.
no,
I could
no,
only make the,
Yes.
yeah,
Yes.
and just as and as I indicate, Chairperson, he didn't explicitly tell me that I've been instructed to remove.
To remove, yeah.
Yes, he didn't.
He didn't say that,
No,
yeah.
he didn't say that.
Yes.
But as I recollect, I do recall around that period, this call happened. And there was an indication that she was abroad.
So you are talking about subsequent developments. Is that because those subsequent developments created a certain impression on you
Yes.
of what had happened, or created in your mind or a link?
Yeah.
Is that what happened? Is that what did not happen? I'm trying to understand why
Yes.
so many years after you would remember these particular calls.
On this, as I explained, on the 2nd, when this news started filtering, and personally, I had not known that he's moving, except when he said we would have to move Themba. But at the same time, the paperwork or anything to that effect, I had not seen it. Now, when that happened, just immediately, I then recalled that there was this discussion when, because I think there were subsequent news to say Themba did not agree and all of that to go and all that. But as I try and recollect, I can remember the time the call happened, and I said, maybe probably it is this. However, it's quite difficult to sit here and say, I know this is what the call was all about.
No, you mustn't say you know something you don't know. so our interest is just
Yeah.
to establish what happened.
Thank you.
Who knows what. It doesn't matter which side it goes. We just want the truth, you know. So prior to the calls, the two calls on the particular day that you received, which related to the president wanting to speak to Minister Chabane, was it usual for you or for the president's staff to phone on your phone when the president wanted to speak to Mr. Chabane? Or
Yes.
was it unusual?
No, it was usual. They would call.
It was
Yeah,
usual.
Yeah. Maybe let me illustrate it in this way. His desk was probably the distance between me and you, so, but there would be a door in
Yes.
between.
Yeah,
So
that's
if
the
they
minister
called-
now.
Yeah,
Yes.
Minister Chabane, sorry. So if they call and then I pick up the call and say, Ms. Minister, close to you. May I also mention, for example, the head of the private office, and I worked very, very closely with her, Ms. Lakela Kaunda. She was the head of the private office of the president at the time, and so I would walk to his desk because he would be close. Or, just like Brent indicated, we would travel together in the car sometimes, and they would call our hand over the phone. If I do recall another call that may have happened on an unrelated matter. We were in Syria at the time. Minister Chabane was accompanied former Deputy President Mutlante. And the call came and I was sitting with him in a restaurant. And then I handed over the call. It was on an unrelated matter.
So are you saying there are certain calls that you remember specifically even after many years have passed?
Yes,
In
I'm saying
regard
that,
to
yeah, like
your-
including that one
Including
of that period of 2011.
Yes.
I'm citing another one where we're in Syria, we are now abroad. I'm also
Yes.
citing, and hence I also indicate the issue of working closely with Ms. Kaunda. For example, when I was Chief of Staff at the DPSA, long after, probably about 6 months after Minister Chabane had passed on the night the President was to announce the movement or the, what is normally called cabinet reshuffle,
Yes.
I was in Namibia in support to the, I think it was the DG at the time, I can't recall, at the DPSA. And she courteously informed me, as a Chief of Staff, you are the head of the Minister's office, so normally things that happen there, you've got to be
You
either
need to know them.
correct them, yes.
Yes.
I was in Namibia. It was in the evening. It was not a text, it was an email, I think, from her Gmail to my Gmail.
That Ms. Kaunda.
Ms. Kaunda, the head
Yes.
of the private office.
Yes.
Now, what I'm saying is that as the head of the private office, she then talks to the Chief of Staff in the ministry, in this case, me. I was still Chief of Staff, Minister Mthetho was acting. And she was informing me that there will be an announcement and Minister Maramatlodi will be your minister. But the point I'm raising is that all of these things do happen, and I recall it was in September 2015. I recall it that one.
So basically what you are saying is there are other communications which you can still remember quite well.
And the
Even
details
after
of,
so many
yes.
years.
Thank you. Yes.
That don't necessarily relate. So it's not just this one.
No, it's not this one.
Yes.
I said it, yeah.
Yes.
And I can indicate that, as I'm indicating that, and I will even remember what it was all about.
Or you'd even remember what it was all about.
Yes, Chairperson, I gave an example on the day former President Mandela died.
Yes.
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 We were in Dubai with Minister Chabane,
Yes.
and it was indicated that please inform Minister that former President Zuma will make a statement on the passing away of former President Mandela. And the relevance of that is that he was Minister in the Presidency and the chair of the Inter-Ministerial Committee in charge of state funerals. In other words, the
Yes.
committee that had to prepare
Yes.
for the funeral of former President Mandela.
Yes.
And he needed to know,
Yes.
and that message came through me.
Yes.
Yes.
And you said
That was 5th of December 2013. We all know when he
Yes.
passed on. Yeah.
And you say you remember that that call came when you were packing in your hotel room, preparing to leave with Minister Chabane to the airport
Yes.
in Dubai.
Yes. On the day, on that day, he liked golf, so he had gone out for a round of golf that afternoon. So when we returned, he had to go to his room to refresh and also finish my packing before we could depart for the airport. In fact, on that night, we were taking a 4:40 flight. It's 20 to 5 in the morning. If I recall, that flight leaves Dubai at 4:40 and lands OR Tambo at around 10:55. It's a daily
Yes.
flight.
Yes.
So it was on the 5th of December, and former President Mandela had passed on that
Yes.
evening, but we were abroad.
Yes.
Yes, and we were about to leave. So I quickly went back. I went to him, I called him on his landline,
Yes.
and then relayed the message. And I think he started actioning to speak to other people at the time who were back home. It would have been in particular the DG in the Presidency who would have been the secretariat or key person in terms of the preparation of the funeral. And we went to the airport and boarded and landed the following morning.
Yes.
Yes.
Now, going back to the 2nd of February 2011, you did not have any communication with Mr. Masego directly himself on that day?
Myself?
Yourself, yeah.
No, Chairperson, I can say it here. I hardly spoke to Mr. Masego.
You hardly spoke to
No.
Mr. Masego.
He was a government spokesperson, and the key
Yes.
people that he would talk to will be spokespersons of various ministries.
Yes.
And I think at the time, there was a spokesperson for Minister Chabane, and as Brent testified, it was not him at the time.
Yes, yes, yes.
So Mr. Masego would have spoken to spokespersons mainly, and in that case, and of course I do know, he worked a lot with the former spokesperson to Minister Chabane.
Yes. And in terms of getting phone calls where the private secretaries of the former president would be wanting to speak to Minister Chabane. Did you say, a few minutes ago, did you say that there were a lot of those or not really?
I'll say, the point is I can't say weekly, daily, or monthly, but at any given time when there is message
They
to
would
be
come.
relayed or to assign a responsibility to Minister Chabane, it will
Yeah.
come. And maybe to use another example, Office of the Deputy President, for example.
Yes.
At one point, we get to the office in the morning, former Deputy President Motlanthe could no longer, his diary had changed, he could no longer travel to an official trip, and I think it was Henan province in China.
Yes.
And we were then called to say, can Minister Chabane prepare to travel on this trip? So I'm just using as another example from the Deputy President. So
Yes.
it would happen like that.
Yes.
As and when he is to or is requested to take a particular responsibility.
Yes.
One other instance, for example, the 50-year Jubilee celebration of the country of Sierra Leone.
Yes.
The former president was invited, but he couldn't travel, and he appointed Minister Chabane to travel as his special envoy to go to that Jubilee. Similar kind of what to call it arrows, and I'm just giving.
You
this- Yes.
you remember a call that came through then as well, or what?
It sometimes, Chairperson, it will be an email
Okay.
from the office. Because
Yes.
It may not necessarily be.
A
The
call.
issue is the assignment
Yeah.
or a message to be relayed,
Yes.
and
yes.
there has to be a communication.
Yes. Yes.
That's the point I'm trying to make.
Yes.
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 So they will then indicate to say, President is unable to travel on this trip. May you please request Minister Chabane to take the trip, and then necessary documentations, if it requires the Department of International Relations to be involved, and then all paperwork is done, and travel will then take place. You will normally be the central point for communication. It does happen to both the PA sometimes, and a lot to the, it does happen to the Chief of Staff, but a lot to the PAs to be for calls, travel, and all of those kind.
Would it be correct to say that you, in part, the reason why you remember these two calls so well is because of the subsequent developments? You did refer to subsequent developments before. I'm saying in part because maybe that's not wholly the reason.
Yes, Chairperson, I can say so.
Or do you think it's wholly because of that?
No, I wouldn't say wholly.
Yeah, but in part because
in
of
part.
that. Yes.
Chairperson, Minister Chabane was another character.
Yes.
That when he deals with you or work with you, and many who worked with him, I'm sure even in the movement, they can tell you how he was. He would be the kind of person who would keep quiet, but at times he opens his mouth, the things he says will be profound. The point I want to get at is, when he said we would have to move we'll have to move timber, he just said, hey, now it rings in me, it's, no, but why would he say, hey, he starts a statement by saying something, hey, we'll have to move. And then, so I began to in part begin to think like what would have happened during this period. And Chairperson, I can't then say it is wholly because of that, but I can only make that.
Yes. Are you able to say from what he said to you, you got any impression about whether what his thinking was about this move that had to be effected of Mr. Masego? Did you get any impression from what he said? I think you may have just said he started by saying A. I don't know whether you had a certain understanding of what A meant.
Yes, having worked with him, I knew what he had. Those who worked with him will know if he wants to say something and start by saying
Oh, he would rather clear
you
his
know what
throat
is
or
coming
something.
is not going to be nice to you. So
Oh.
I knew a lot of.
Of
I
some
knew
of
when,
his,
yes, correct. I
his
knew.
the way he talked.
The way he talked and the way
Yes.
he would address himself. And as I'm saying, and Chairperson, maybe here we're speaking about a minister who was in government, and I worked for him in government, but a lot of comrades can attest to in my movement, the African National Congress. They would know him. They would know him how he behaves. So he would be that kind of person. There were instances where I knew whether he's angry, happy, or what kind of, if he's serious. Yeah. One example I can use is that, one instance I can use is that sometimes he would communicate things, and as a chief of staff, you just feel like, is this the right way we can go? Because remember, as a chief of staff, you are the administrator in chief. You are the one who is expected to know the law.
Yes.
So you need to know the PFMA, you need to know the Public Service Act and the Public Service Regulations.
Yes,
So if you
yes.
realize certain things may not necessarily
Be in
the best
accordance
way
with
to
the
deal
law.
with it, I would go back and say, on the matter you raised yesterday or on this particular, this is how you suggested. I felt maybe we can just, and he says, no, this is how we'll proceed. Then you know that's final.
Then you know he has
It's
made
final.
up his
So
mind.
I'm trying to illustrate how I understood how he is. So when he said, hey, so it just said something to me.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah. But at the time, it didn't make a lot of sense. I couldn't understand why. But when the events started unfolding and things were confirmed, I then said, okay. That's why even when I asked him who, he said Jimmy Manya, I said, okay, and I didn't see anything wrong with that because at the time, because Mr. Manya was a DG in another department. Yeah.
You say you could tell when he was angry, you could tell when he was happy. Are you able to say whether, as far as you knew him, he was happy about moving Mr. Masego from GCIS to DPSA? Or is that something you were not able to
No,
tell?
I couldn't deduce at the time.
You could not tell
couldn't,
that?
yeah.
Okay, no, thank you very much. Is there anything, Ms. Wenzel?
No, nothing
Yes.
further.
The only thing I don't know if you want to say anything. I am concerned that you indicated at the beginning of your evidence something along the lines that you may have preferred not to come and give evidence.
Yes, Chairperson.
I don't know whether you feel comfortable to tell me what may have made you feel like that, or is that something you are not?
No, I can say so.
Yes,
I can
please.
say so. Chairperson, let me put it this way, that I have utmost respect for former President Zuma. Minister Chabani was a minister under President Zuma's administration. He served at the behest of former President Zuma. Whatever may have happened between an employer and employee, or supervisor and supervisee. But I think, Chairperson, what is most important for me now, we're sitting here, or my resolve not to come, was the fact that I had spent very good 5 years with Minister Chabani. And now that is, in fact, his passing away struck a very hardcore pain emotionally for months. And it was one of the reasons why I then initiated to say, can I move out of a political office? Because I had served under him, I had served under Minister Mteto, Minister Ramatlodi. And then at one point I could have served another minister, but I then chose to move out. So it has been very painful. I'm also mindful of Mrs. Chabani and the kids where they are. I didn't want to come here and myself opening an emotional wound.
Oh, okay.
But I respect you, Chairperson, the work you do, and the judiciary in its entirety. And when the investigator said to me, if the chair asks you to come, would you do so? I said, I will. And that's why I'm here. But I personally felt it would I would leave it to the chairperson of the commission to find the truth in other ways. I'm sure the mechanisms are there.
No, thank you very much. I was not aware that you were feeling uneasy about it. I'm not necessarily saying if you were feeling uneasy, the decision would have been different, but I'm just saying I wasn't aware. But I thank you that you came. Thank you for your evidence. I think the impression I get is that because of how close you were to
Yes.
Minister Chabane, you would have preferred not to
Yes.
talk about things that relate
Thank you, Chair.
to him.
Yes.
So I appreciate that.
Thank you.
But thank you very much, and you are excused.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
That's the last witness you
Yes,
had
it is
for
the
the
last
day.
witness for the day.
Yes. Okay, we are unfortunately going to adjourn the proceedings for the day. And then we will continue tomorrow. We will start, I think, at 9:30. Are we starting at 9:30 tomorrow? No, we're starting at 10, I think. We're starting at 10 o'clock tomorrow. We'll be hearing further evidence from Mr. Tukwana, and I think there'll be 2 witnesses, if I'm not mistaken. So we will continue tomorrow. We adjourn.
All rise.